Dragger, an original novel by Robert Napier, narration and images powered by AI. Chapter 6, Annoyance, Grief, Tenderness, and Terror. Dex had been training every day. She estimated a year or more had passed since she left the Gore Sty to become a callow. The training ground, known as the Thrash, was an area behind the courtyard. The Thrash was, at its core, a sandy circle enclosed by irregular rocks, piled haphazardly with bones. A third of the arena was covered by scaffolding that spilled over into various teetering platforms. On the other side of the arena was a pergola of cobblestones and driftwood. Ragged flags and banners cluttered the area. They constantly whipped and frayed in the damp winds that howled out of the wastelands. At the training ground, others were sparring. The sparring there was continual, at all hours, in all weathers. Someone was always training or fighting, being disciplined, punished, or executed. Usually, these were indistinguishable, if not simultaneous. Likewise, there were certain rules of Gnarlstead that were set in stone, literally carved into the sharp boulders stationed around the compound. Rules like, obey father, defy all, family first, trust no one, death is a blessing, be generous, pause is nothing, take all, and so on. Of course, Dex couldn't read, so she took Rux's word for what the stones said. Then, there were less clear rules floating about like, don't talk to anyone. This precept was enforced at random, and always after the fact. The callows generally felt safe talking to each other, but had a custom of looking over their shoulders. And while it was the callows' duty to take supplies to the barracks outside the walls, they didn't dare speak to the soldiers. Similarly, slaves rarely spoke to any callows. Another difficult rule to interpret was something like protect your home. Taking for granted that Gnarlstead was home, Aunt Ruby found many ways for Dex to protect it. Doing repairs, cleaning up messes, foot patrols, fishing and foraging for food, caring for the Gores, digging ditches, and staying out of Ruby's way. Beyond that, there were other expectations that Dex was clearly too stupid to understand. If she admitted being tired, she was weak. If she wouldn't admit it, she was pig-headed. If she overslept even a little, she was a good-for-nothing layabout. If she got up too early, she was a snoopy little kiss-ass. If she ate all her food, she was a greedy Gore. If she left any food, she was a wasteful ingrate. And these rules applied or not, as Ruby saw fit to enforce them. Thus, all the callows lived in constant fear, not just of Ruby, but of the resident war ghouls. They were charged with supervising the callows. It was unknown how many there were, as they wore uniforms and masks, even switching uniforms between them. They rarely ever spoke, were quick to violence, and enforced the arbitrary rules of Ruby with whips and canes. They stood silently on the periphery, even watching the callows while they slept. They were not caretakers, however, and did not go looking for their wards. But if they caught you doing something they didn't like, and this could be any number of different things at any given time, they would fall on you with cruelty. Every morning, the callows were expected to gather for group exercises. There was about 20 of them, though the ranks changed if someone was injured, killed, exiled, or simply vanished. Father Dragger came and went. Sometimes he stayed for just hours, sometimes for weeks. He always brought someone with him and left with others. Dex enjoyed the group exercises, though, even if they were strenuous and dangerous. The callows would stand in ordered rows, usually in front of Aunt Ruby, seated up high under the pergola. Together and in unison, they would follow set patterns of movements. Dex didn't really understand the purpose of the movements, but they required balance, concentration, and stamina. Rux had explained to her that it was like fighting against ghosts or shadows. You had to pretend the enemy was in front of you. Dex preferred fighting shadows, but Father Dragger insisted that the callows fight each other. Before afternoon feeding, Aunt Ruby would select 2 or more callows to fight, and they really did fight. Dex couldn't believe that people would kick and hit and toss each other so carelessly. Thankfully, Ruby would rarely let anyone fight Dex. Aunt Ruby would laugh and say the meanest things, that Dex was stupid, weak, slow, ugly, frail, skinny, and most of all, worthless. But Dex didn't care because she didn't want to fight like that. Not at all. She preferred spending time in the gore sty with Runty. She dreaded the thrash, no matter how much time she was forced to spend there. In the evening, when they were allowed to train on their own, Dex did her best to make herself invisible by climbing into the scaffolding around the thrash. She could go unnoticed up there and could watch what the others were doing. The other Callows treated her indifferently, but she could feel their attention turning on her whenever she approached. As a group, they rarely spoke, always obeyed, and their lusterless eyes were constantly moving. They were always at war with each other, always searching for an edge, for weakness. Dex could sense them searching her, and at times swore she could hear their very thoughts, wondering, calculating how to undermine and destroy potential rivals for Father's esteem. Besides Rux, there was only one other person who ever chatted with her. This was a girl, maybe 2 or 3 years older, who had the bizarre habit of smiling. Dex tried to appreciate all the food, shelter, clothing, and purpose in life that Father gave to the Callows, but she could rarely muster a proper smile. This girl, Gretch, seemed to hop along enjoying everything Gnarlstead had to offer. As far as Dex could tell, she was approved of by the others, though she was not very fast or strong. Dex thought she might be pretty, but couldn't tell with that smile hiding her face. Not very often, Gretch would glide up the scaffolding too. Being near anyone always made Dex anxious. The other Callows, if they noticed her at all, would usually laugh at her and pull her thick, crimpy hair in all directions. On one occasion, a boy named Slake had pulled her hair so hard that she fell, and he dragged her across the thrash. This had amused everyone except Dex, who was apparently too stupid to understand the joke. After that, Gretch had offered to shave Dex's head to prevent such activities. By straining and pulling, Gretch had mowed down one side of Dex's scalp with a dull razor, but when it came time for the other side, Dex had had quite enough. And anyway, that side of her head had jagged scars from before, and she couldn't bear the idea of Gretch trying to scrape around them. Today, they sat quietly for a while until Gretch asked, "What are we doing?" Dex didn't have an answer. She was just trying to stay out of the way. Even though she hated and feared everyone, she also hated and feared being alone all the time. I don't know, trying to count the war goals. Gretch giggled. Why? They're always changing, moving around. They've spent their whole lives learning from Father, Gretch said with admiration. They're ruthless, efficient, and treacherous. I guess watching them is good training. It's the war ghouls that keep the Sawjaws and river pirates away, and the brigands in check. I can't wait to be one. They sat quietly for a while. Gretch occasionally pointed to one of the war ghouls as they would appear and disappear throughout the compound. But Gretch's eyes would constantly drift back to the thrash and affix on Rux. Of course, Dex noticed this, but wasn't going to say anything. She liked to watch him too, and she didn't entirely understand why. Rux exercised with a large iron ball at the end of a long haft. He would swing it and toss it and spin it for hours. Dex could see his arms, chest, and legs rippling and growing like a gore. Gretch smiled. Watching him is good training too. Dex turned away. He's one of the best Callows, she said too hastily. Gretch considered her response with a casual nod. He's not the oldest or the biggest, but he works harder than anyone else. He'll be a war ghoul soon. Dex shuddered at the idea of Rux becoming like a war ghoul. Physically, it would be no problem at all, but it just didn't seem right. Perhaps betraying too much curiosity, Dex asked, "How do you know?" "There's a rank," said Gretch, like it was the most obvious thing in the world that Dex must have forgot. Dex nodded blankly. "It was always safer to agree. You have to sense it more than understand it," smiled Gretch. "The others act like they understand, but I think they're clueless." Dex watched the other Callows sparring and exercising, and wondered if they had come from villages like hers, who their friends were, and why they hated each other so much. "Look at Rux and Crux," started Gretch. They were as new to Gnarlstead as Dex, but the two larger boys quickly fell into Dragger's favor, while she had not. They are the two best at everything, and they train together constantly. Though they're both older than us, they arrived around the same time as you. Dex nodded approvingly, but she didn't know what to think about Gretch's theory. Then the next ranking would be Lurk, Murmur, and Cringe. They're all three quiet and intelligent. They prefer games and strategies. Whenever it's time to fight, they're put together, 2 against 1. They train to face multiple opponents, as well as to work together to create openings. Dex pointed out that they never defend each other, though. Very close to them are Coral, Kasaban, and Slake. Kasabian is the oldest girl, but she acts childish. She's a real nut beetle. Dex had noticed that Coral and Slake seemed to compete for Kasabian's attention for reasons that she could not fathom. Her attention was random and terrorizing. During morning practice, these 6 stood out as a group, constantly vying for position behind Rux and Crux. Then there's Vago. You know all about him. Indeed, Dex was all too familiar with Vago. They always made her wrestle with him because they were closest in age. Wrestling was encouraged among the Callows. Wrestle for food, wrestle for blankets, wrestle for no fucking reason. But Vago was taller than some older Callows, and he was vicious. He would hurt her on purpose, squeezing, pulling, biting even, especially when Father was watching. He seemed to think making Dex scream or cry would make Father love him better. Father says that the winner gets stronger, but the loser gets smarter. Dex didn't feel any smarter though, so she found herself abandoned even by the laws of the cosmos. Despite spending so much time together, often cheek to cheek in each other's arms, there was no fondness or camaraderie between them. Whenever Dex came near Vago, he would hit her or spit at her. Vago resented that he was always paired with Dex. She was by far the smallest and the weakest. Even though he always beat her, it was never satisfying. It felt like a joke, and the others often teased him about it. One thing Vago truly excelled at, however, was the javelin throw. His gangly arms were ideal for hurling the javelin, and he spent most his evenings at the range. Whenever Dex spotted Vago with a javelin in his hand, she went the other way, towards cover. And the twins Swango and Ixulingo, expounded Gretch, presumably for the first time out loud. They're the most mysterious. They're girls like us, except pretty. They don't fit into the ranking system. She lowered her voice with a quick side to side. They move freely around Gnarlstead, and I heard they've even been inside the manor with Aunt Ruby. I don't envy them for that, though. Let's see. Then there's Bludge, Agatha, Slayton, Graven, and me. Others have come and gone, but you get the idea. Dex was more confused than ever. So anyway, where do you hide all the time? Dex snapped alert. She felt her face flush. What are you talking about? I know you go somewhere when you want to hide from Ruby or Vago or just about everyone. You just sneak away somewhere. I walk around, like everybody else. Nowhere. I mean, there's nowhere to go anyway. Why? Gretch smiled and giggled, then dripped from the scaffolding like rainwater. No reason. Bye. Tyrek felt a rush of warm relief. A weight he hadn't noticed dropped from his back and shoulders, and he floated slowly down as he rolled onto his side. He was at his family home just outside Kahijo. He was in bed, subdued by heavy blankets and low candles, barely burning on the nightstand. He couldn't see well in the dim light, but he was sure this was home. Home, at last, and further proof, if any was needed. Lady Morwen Dweller, his bride, lay beside him. The covers rested just below her buttocks, and he couldn't help but brush his hand over her curves and shoulders. He breathed a deep sigh of safety and satisfaction. Sweat and candlelight still hummed on her skin. They had made love, as they had on the night before he left for the Legion. He must have been half asleep. He laughed at himself, but it was understandable how exhausting it had been. His hurried ride home across Silk Mill and Deanwine had been grueling, but worth it. And what a struggle it had been to tear down the walls of Gnarlstead's dungeon. A terrible fight to break free, it was. It must have been. How else? How could he be here otherwise? A chill pierced his ribcage. Was this a sweet dream to interrupt a dismal reality? Or was Gnarlstead the nightmare that he had finally broken out of? Soreness in his thigh and a drop of sweat off his nose assured him he was awake. You're awake, said Morwen. It sounded less like a question and more like a chastisement. Of course I'm awake, said Tyrek, too proud to admit he must have been half asleep the whole time. How else could I make love to my beautiful wife? Morwen snorted. I should have known. Tyrek lazily ran his fingers up and down her spine, enjoying the softness of her skin. Known what, my love? When you pressed me onto my belly. I should have known the dram was wearing off. Tyrek thought he misheard her. He shook his head and rubbed his eyes. What are you talking about? Shrill dread pulsed through his limbs as his mind raced to make sense of things. His eyes darted freshly around the room. Where were the gossamer curtains and high bedposts? Where were the marble fireplace and his grandfather's writing desk? It must have been the ride to get here. I'm not feeling well. The ride, indeed. The woman rose contemptuously out of the bed. Before Tyrek could get a clear look at her naked back, a pair of hands covered her in a crimson robe. Whose hands? One of the children? Derek? Morik? They shouldn't be in here. He bolted out of bed, taking the covers with him like armor. "What's going on?" he demanded. "You sound like you're head of the household, dear," said the woman, brushing her frazzled hair back into a tight bun. Before she could turn, Tyrek growled, "No," as if his words could stop reality from settling in his scalp. She turned anyway. Ruby Lone planted a hand on her hip and frowned at him. Her makeup was mostly gone, leaving darkened streaks on her mouth and eyes. She was wearing a broad necklace, almost like a yoke, that was made of colored shards of glass. Her crimson robe was loosely tied, barely covering her breasts, and one long leg stood bare and taunting. "But you're not." "What did you do, witch?" Ruby bleated. "Witch? I haven't been called that in a long time. But the better question is," Ruby untied the robe, revealing flesh from her cleavage to her abdomen. One hand touched the necklace, while the other caressed the line just above her pelvis. "What have you done?" Tyrek searched frantically for his clothing, but found nothing. Angered by the humiliation and powerlessness, he dashed forward and seized Ruby by the throat. She made no move to counter him. Two war ghouls stepped forward. They were dressed in bone and fur, with veils over their faces. Tyrek leaned into her. "I should kill you." He had been imprisoned for years, but well kept, and his privation had only tightened the cords of his muscles. "You think you scare me? You think your soft hands and slender frame can hurt me? I've been ripped apart by a god. You're just a man." Tyrek didn't know what to do with his fury. He looked at the ghouls, gauging their intention. Ruby wiped Tyrek's hand away from her neck, and he let it fall lifelessly to his side. "Don't mind them. They're just here to learn." "Learn from you? Learn what?" "How weak men really are. And what if I escape?" "Be my guest. There's a dozen manslayers in this wing alone, not to mention all the predators outside." Ruby tightened the robe as Tyrek stared in revulsion. She quirked her head. "Such hatred, Commander Dweller, such desperation. Now you're starting to interest me. How about another drink? You can keep calling me Morwen, if it helps." Tyrek turned away, partially looking for an exit, but mostly looking for oblivion. "Really, I don't mind at all. Whatever fills the void." "Never!" "How about one of them?" Ruby dangled her fingers in the direction of the ghouls. The pair, in unison, let their fur cloaks slide off their shoulders, revealing the skin of their bodies. They were fair girls, toned from their training. With theatrical gestures, Ruby lifted the veils from their faces. They were identical. Twins. Tyrek didn't want to look at them, but their pale, unmoving eyes captured his, like a light from the other side of an abandoned tunnel. "Take either, or both. It's all the same." Ruby snickered at her own callous joke. "What have you done to me?" Tyrek groaned as a sharp ache split his head. Ruby lightly touched her neck. The necklace was made of coarse straps, braided tightly. The woven strands held a dense array of tiny vials. Each container was filled, at least partially, with leaves or liquids of varying colors. She stroked a thin vial between her fingers. "I can do, or make you do, anything I want. I can even make you do what you want." "This will never happen again," Tyrek spat. Ruby rolled her eyes. "Yes, darling, you say that every time." Ruby sat on a cushioned stool, pulling the robe over her and ordering the ghouls to get dressed. One of the pale ghouls handed Tyrek a long shirt to wear over his lank body. They left the dim room and headed down a corridor. Tyrek had no memory of how he got here and couldn't be sure where he was. But given the crude decor and musty smell, he was somewhere inside Gnarlstead Manor. As he was marched down the hall between the ghouls, glancing through the doorway, he saw several uniformed men, Crushan officers, smoking pipes and drinking around a gambling table. The youngest locked eyes with Tyrek as he passed, raised a mug. Before they turned the corner to the downward stairs, he heard the officer say, "He's had 3 this time," and their laughter haunted him all the way to the dungeon. Back in the familiar discomfort of his prison, Tyrek shrank with despair. The 2 ghouls posted themselves on either side of the sturdy door. Even if he could overpower the 3 women, he couldn't get far, not in a nightshirt. There were swords, axes, arms, and armor on the hallway walls, but there were likely soldiers at every junction. His escape would have to wait for something to change. But in the dank room, he didn't know what he was waiting for. For what it's worth, you were never meant to remember any of this. That was my idea. Ruby poured a goblet of wine from the pitcher on his table. Tyrek kept his back to her. If she wanted to kill him, that was easy enough, and he couldn't stand to look at her now. Ruby twisted a sleek red vial from her collar of potions and deftly emptied it into the cup. Those men you saw, they pay out fortunes for my drams, seducing each other's wives and daughters, sons and brothers, and afterwards their prey pays me even more. Ruby swirled the concoction at arm's length. When Tyrek refused to turn like a pouting child, she set the goblet on the table. You're not the beast Dragger thinks you are. I don't know why he bothers. You don't have the teeth for it, but I don't know. It's sweet how you breathe on my neck and touch me with your fingertips. Since you're too frail to face reality, I'll leave this as a gift. If you drink it soon enough, it'll be like none of this ever happened. You'll wake up in your bed, tired, probably a headache, but inexplicably relaxed. Or don't drink it. And every time you dream of fucking your precious little wife, I'll be there too. Tyrek didn't answer. Ruby gathered her robe around her waist. I hate the cold floor on my feet. What if Dragger finds out? Tyrek meant it as a threat, but it came out like worry. Ruby stopped in the doorway, looking over her shoulder as the robe slipped down her arm. Dragger knows everything. This was his idea. Good God, why? What does he want? Ruby turned to Tyrek, candidly. Her face was sad and so earnest that he almost felt compassion for her. She reached for his hand, but didn't touch him. In that moment, she was a mixture of annoyance, grief, tenderness, and terror. Don't you know? He wants your children.
Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe.